The old, abandoned house on Femi Street had always been a mystery in Lagos. For years, people avoided it, telling tales of strange noises and eerie lights coming from within. No one knew who or what lived inside, but everyone in the neighborhood agreed on one thing: the house was haunted. One rainy evening, a new family moved into the neighborhood. Mr. and Mrs. Okoro, along with their children, Adana and Chidi, were excited about their new home. They had heard the rumors, but they didn't believe in ghosts. To them, the stories were just tales meant to scare children. They were confident that the house was just an old building that needed some love and care. As they settled into their new home, strange things began to happen. On their first night, as the family sat down to dinner, the lights flickered. Mrs. Okoro, a practical woman, dismissed it as a problem with the old wiring. But then, they heard it, a soft, distant whisper, like the wind blowing through the trees. Except there was no wind, and the sound seemed to come from inside the house. Adana and Chidi exchanged nervous glances. "Did you hear that?" Adana asked, her voice trembling. "It's just the house settling," Mr. Okoro said, trying to reassure them. But even he looked uneasy. That night, as the family slept, the whispers returned, louder this time. Adana woke up with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the whispers, clearer now, like someone was standing right next to her bed, speaking words she couldn't understand. She pulled the covers over her head, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder. In the morning, Adana told her parents about the whispers. "It was like someone was in my room," she said, her eyes wide with fear. Chidi nodded in agreement. "I heard it too," he added. "It sounded like they were calling our names." Mr. and Mrs. Okoro exchanged worried looks. They had also heard the whispers but didn't want to scare the children any more than they already were. "It's just your imagination," Mrs. Okoro said, forcing a smile. "There's nothing to be afraid of." But as the days passed, the strange occurrences only intensified. Objects in the house began to move on their own. Adana's favorite doll would be found in different places each morning, even though she was sure she had left it on her bed. Chidi's books would fall off the shelves for no apparent reason, scattering across the floor. One night, as the family gathered in the living room, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. Their breath came out in visible puffs, and the air felt thick, heavy with an unseen presence. Then, they heard it, a loud bang coming from upstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that echoed through the house. Mr. Okoro grabbed a flashlight and slowly made his way up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The rest of the family followed closely behind, their fear palpable. As they reached the top of the stairs, the footsteps stopped. The hallway was empty, but the air was charged with an eerie energy. "Who's there?" Mr. Okoro called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, only silence. He pushed open the door to Adana's room, and there, in the middle of the floor, was her doll. Its eyes, once friendly and warm, now seemed cold and lifeless, staring up at them with an unsettling intensity. Mrs. Okoro gasped, pulling Adana close. "We need to leave this house," she whispered, her voice shaking. But Mr. Okoro hesitated. They had spent all their savings on this home, they couldn't just leave. "We'll figure this out," he said, trying to sound confident, but deep down, he knew something was very wrong. The next day, the family decided to seek help. They visited the local church and spoke to Pastor Adebayo, a wise and kind man who had lived in the neighborhood for years. He listened to their story, nodding thoughtfully. "The house you live in has a dark history," Pastor Adebayo said. "Many years ago, a man named Chief Obina owned that house. He was a powerful man, feared by many. But he was also cruel and greedy. It is said that he made a deal with dark forces to gain his wealth and power. When he died, his spirit couldn't rest. It is believed that his spirit still haunts the house, searching for peace that he will never find." The Okoros were horrified. They had never heard of Chief Obina or his terrible deeds. "What can we do?" Mr. Okoro asked, desperate for a solution. Pastor Adebayo handed them a small bottle of holy water. "Sprinkle this in every room and pray. I will come by tomorrow to bless the house. But remember, this spirit is powerful. You must be strong and not let fear take over." That night, the Okoros did as the pastor instructed. They sprinkled the holy water in every room and prayed for protection. But the house remained eerily silent, as if it was waiting, watching. Just as they were about to go to bed, the whispers returned, louder than ever. This time, they were clear, unmistakable. "Leave this place," the voice hissed, sending chills down their spines. The family huddled together, too scared to move. And then, the walls began to shake. Pictures fell from the walls, and the floorboards creaked as if something was moving underneath them. The whispers grew into a roar, a deafening noise that filled the house. Mr. Okoro grabbed his family and ran out of the house, not stopping until they were safely outside. They stood on the street, gasping for breath, their hearts racing. "What do we do now?" Adana asked, tears streaming down her face. "We can't stay here," Mrs. Okoro said, holding her children close. "We have to leave." But as they turned to leave, the front door of the house slowly creaked open, as if inviting them back inside. The whispers had stopped, and the night was eerily quiet. The house seemed to be watching them, waiting for them to make a move. Mr. Okoro stared at the house, his mind racing. They couldn't just leave, this was their home. But how could they stay in a place that was clearly dangerous? He knew they needed help, but who could they turn to? As they stood there, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was an old woman, her hair white as snow, her eyes piercing. She walked with a cane, her steps slow but purposeful. "You shouldn't be here," the old woman said, her voice gravelly. "This house is cursed. It's been that way for generations." "Who are you?" Mr. Okoro asked, his voice trembling. "My name is Mama Kemi," she replied. "I've lived in this neighborhood for many years. I knew Chief Obina and saw what he did. That house is not just haunted, it's a prison for his spirit. And it won't rest until it gets what it wants." "And what does it want?" Mrs. Okoro asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mama Kemi looked at the house, her expression grim. "It wants redemption. But that's something only you can give it." The Okoros exchanged worried looks. They had no idea how to help a restless spirit, especially one as vengeful as Chief Obina's. But Mama Kemi seemed to know more than she was letting on. "What do we have to do?" Mr. Okoro asked, his voice filled with desperation. Mama Kemi sighed, her eyes full of sorrow. "You must find the object that ties his spirit to this world. It's hidden somewhere in the house. Once you find it, you must destroy it. Only then will his spirit be free." The thought of going back into the house terrified the Okoros, but they knew they had no choice. They couldn't live in fear forever. With Mama Kemi's guidance, they prepared to face the spirit of Chief Obina and end the curse that had plagued their home. The next morning, the family returned to the house with Mama Kemi. The old woman led them to the attic, a place they had avoided since moving in. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like curtains. It was a dark, gloomy space, filled with old furniture and forgotten memories. "This is where it all began," Mama Kemi said, her voice echoing in the empty room. "Chief Obina used to come up here to practice his dark rituals. Somewhere in this room is the object that binds him to this world." The family began to search the attic, moving boxes and sifting through old belongings. Hours passed, and they found nothing. Frustration and fear began to set in, and they wondered if they were making a mistake. Just as they were about to give up, Adana noticed something strange about one of the floorboards. It was loose, as if it had been pried up and put back in place. She called out to her father, who carefully lifted the board. Beneath it, they found a small, intricately carved box. "This must be it," Mr. Okoro said, his voice trembling with excitement and fear. He opened the box, revealing a necklace with a large, dark stone. It pulsed with an eerie energy, as if it was alive. Mama Kemi's eyes widened. "That's it. The necklace holds his spirit. You must destroy it." But as Mr. Okoro reached for the necklace, the air in the attic grew heavy, almost suffocating. A cold wind swirled around them, even though there were no windows open. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever, echoing through the attic, "Leave. Leave. Leave." Adana clutched her mother's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "Daddy, don't touch it. She cried out, but it was too late. Mr. Okoro had already grabbed the necklace. As soon as his fingers closed around it, the room shook violently. The old furniture rattled, and the floorboards creaked as if they might give way. Suddenly, the shadows in the room seemed to come to life, swirling around Mr. Okoro. He tried to pull away, but the necklace seemed to burn in his hand, its heat searing through his skin. He screamed in pain, dropping the box to the floor, but the necklace clung to his hand as if it had a mind of its own. Mrs. Okoro rushed to her husband's side, trying to help him, but an invisible force pushed her back. She stumbled and fell, her heart racing in terror. Adana and Chidi were frozen in place, too scared to move. "Mama Kemi, do something!" Chidi shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Mama Kemi stepped forward, her face set in determination. She began to chant in a language the children didn't understand, her voice rising above the chaos in the attic. The wind grew stronger, whipping around the room, but Mama Kemi stood firm. The necklace's dark stone began to glow, a sinister light that filled the attic. Mr. Okoro's screams intensified as the shadows tightened around him, pulling him toward the center of the room. Mama Kemi continued to chant, her voice growing louder and more forceful with each word. Then, with a final shout, Mama Kemi thrust her cane at the necklace. The glowing stone cracked with a deafening sound, and a burst of light filled the room, blinding everyone. The shadows recoiled, retreating as the light grew brighter, filling every corner of the attic. The room shook one last time, and then, everything went still. The wind stopped, the whispers ceased, and the attic was plunged into silence. The necklace, now broken, lay in pieces on the floor, its dark energy gone. Mr. Okoro collapsed, gasping for breath. Mrs. Okoro rushed to his side, helping him sit up. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Okoro nodded weakly, his face pale. "I'm fine," he whispered, though his voice betrayed his fear. "It's over. Isn't it?" Mama Kemi, who had also collapsed from exhaustion, nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "The spirit is gone. Chief Obina has been freed." Relief washed over the family, but it was mixed with a lingering sense of unease. The house was quiet now, but the memories of what had just happened would not easily fade. As they helped Mama Kemi downstairs, she turned to them and said, "The house is no longer cursed, but it will never be the same. The past has a way of leaving its mark. You must decide if you want to stay or find a new home." The Okoros looked at each other, their minds heavy with the weight of everything they had just experienced. They knew that staying in the house would be a constant reminder of the horrors they had faced. But leaving would mean starting over, something they weren't sure they were ready for. For the next few days, the family lived in a state of uncertainty. The house was quiet, almost peaceful, but the memories of the spirit lingered in every corner. Adana and Chidi refused to sleep in their rooms, and Mr. and Mrs. Okoro found themselves waking up in the middle of the night, half expecting to hear the whispers return. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, a knock came at the door. Mr. Okoro answered it, and to his surprise, a young man stood on the doorstep. He was dressed in simple clothes, his expression serious. "Good evening," the young man said, bowing slightly. "My name is Tunde. I'm a historian, and I've been researching the history of this house. I heard about what happened here, and I'd like to help you." Mr. Okoro frowned, puzzled. "Help us? How?" Tunde glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I know about Chief Obina and the curse that plagued this house. But what you may not know is that there's more to the story. The necklace you destroyed was just one part of it. The spirit may be gone, but the darkness that lingers here is not." The Okoros exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Okoro asked, her voice trembling. Tunde stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "There's something else hidden in this house, something that even Chief Obina was afraid of. If it's not dealt with, the curse will never truly be lifted. I can help you find it, but you must trust me." The family hesitated. They had already been through so much, and the thought of facing more danger was almost too much to bear. But something in Tunde's eyes told them that he was telling the truth, that there was still a darkness lurking within their home. Finally, Mr. Okoro nodded. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice firm. "We want to be free of this curse once and for all." Tunde smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Then let's begin. There's no time to waste." The search for the hidden darkness began that very night. With Tunde's guidance, the family combed through the house, looking for anything out of the ordinary. They checked every room, every corner, but found nothing. It wasn't until they returned to the attic that they felt the familiar chill in the air, the sense of being watched. Tunde walked to the far end of the room, where an old mirror stood covered in dust. He wiped it clean, revealing a reflection that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. "This mirror," Tunde said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a mirror. It's a gateway, a portal to the darkness that still resides here." As the family stared into the mirror, the room seemed to tilt, and the reflection in the glass shifted. Instead of their own faces, they saw the image of a dark, swirling void, a place that seemed to reach out and pull them in. "We must destroy it," Tunde said, his voice filled with urgency. "It's the source of the darkness, the last piece of the curse. But be warned, once we break the mirror, the darkness will fight back." The Okoros felt a surge of fear, but they knew they had no choice. They had to finish what they started. With trembling hands, Mr. Okoro grabbed a heavy metal candlestick and raised it above his head. But just as he was about to strike the mirror, the room exploded with a blast of cold wind. The lights flickered, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than before. The mirror seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if it was alive, resisting their attempts to destroy it. Tunde grabbed the candlestick from Mr. Okoro, his face set in determination. "This is my fight," he said, his voice steady. "I've spent my life preparing for this moment. I won't let the darkness win." With all his strength, Tunde brought the candlestick down on the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, the pieces flying across the room like shards of ice. As the mirror broke, the room was plunged into darkness, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, screaming and howling in anger. The ground beneath them shook, and the walls seemed to close in. It felt as though the house itself was collapsing, being torn apart by the unleashed fury of the darkness. But then, as quickly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The voices fell silent, the ground stilled, and the air grew warm again. The mirror was gone, reduced to a pile of broken glass on the floor. Tunde fell to his knees, breathing heavily. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "The darkness is gone. The curse is lifted." The Okoros stood in stunned silence, their hearts pounding with relief and exhaustion. The house was finally free of the curse that had plagued it for so long. They could feel it in the air, a sense of peace that had been absent for far too long. As they helped Tunde to his feet, the family knew that they had finally put the past behind them. The house was theirs once more, no longer a place of fear, but a home where they could build new memories. But as they stood there, a small, almost imperceptible sound echoed through the attic. A faint, distant whisper, as if the darkness had not yet given up entirely. The Okoros exchanged uneasy glances. Had they truly defeated the curse, or was there still something lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? Tunde, noticing their fear, offered a reassuring smile. "It's over," he said, though his eyes betrayed a hint of doubt. "You're safe now." But as they left the attic, the mirror's shattered pieces glinted in the dim light.